The proposal hung in the air, its implications unfolding in the silence that followed. What Richard was suggesting represented a profound role reversal, from perpetuating discriminatory practices to actively participating in their dismantling, from authority figure to cautionary example. "Why come to me with this?" Marcus asked, though he had already begun to anticipate the answer. "The video of our confrontation is central to their training approach," Richard explained. "While it's already public, they would need your explicit permission to use it in this context. And," he paused, the second reason seemingly more difficult to articulate, "your perspective on whether this represents genuine atonement or merely—" He trailed off, searching for the word. "Rehabilitation of your image," Sophia supplied, her tone making it clear she had considered this possibility. Richard nodded, accepting the characterization without protest. "I understand your skepticism. 6 months ago, I might have seen this as merely a strategic career move. Now," he gestured vaguely at his worn appearance, "there's no career left to salvage, only the possibility of ensuring that what happened at Westfield Heights serves some purpose beyond my personal downfall." Marcus studied Richard, seeing beyond the surface changes, the weight loss, the less expensive clothing, the absence of the authoritative manner that had once defined him, to the more fundamental shift occurring within. Not complete, certainly. Not perfect, but genuine in ways that strategic calculation could not convincingly simulate. "It's not my permission you should be seeking," Marcus said finally. "It's from the residents who experienced years of discrimination under your management. Dr. Washington, Mrs. Gonzalez, Mr. Williams, they're the ones whose lives were directly affected by the systems you enforced." Richard absorbed this redirection, his expression suggesting it hadn't occurred to him to consider the residents' perspectives as primary. Another blind spot revealed and acknowledged. "You're right, of course. I should speak with them directly." "Which would have been impossible under your previous management approach," Sophia observed. "The barriers you established between desirable and other residents ensured you never had to confront the human impact of your policies." Richard nodded slowly, the observation landing with visible effect. "That's exactly the pattern the training program aims to disrupt. The detachment that allows discrimination to continue without personal recognition of its consequences." Marcus made a decision, one that balanced accountability with the potential for redemption. "I'll arrange a meeting with the resident council. They can hear your proposal directly and decide collectively whether to support your participation in this initiative. I'll abide by their determination." The solution embodied the transformed governance of Westfield Heights. Decisions made not by a single authority figure but through representative input from those most affected. Richard's expression reflected recognition of this shift, another stark contrast between the building's past and present. "Thank you," he said simply. "That's more than I expected." As Richard prepared to leave, Marcus had one final question. "Do you know why I bought Westfield Heights specifically, out of all the properties in Boston?" Richard shook his head. "I assumed for the investment potential. The location and historical significance make it highly valuable." "Partly," Marcus acknowledged. "But 15 years ago, when I was a graduate student at Harvard, I applied for an apartment here. I had excellent credit, references, and income. From my first startup, I never even got a response. When I called to follow up, I was told all units had been filled. But my white classmate applied the following week and got a unit immediately." Recognition dawned on Richard's face, not just of the specific incident, but of how it represented countless similar experiences that had occurred under his management. "I couldn't prove anything then," Marcus continued, "but I promised myself that someday I'd change things from the inside. When Wellington put the building up for sale, it felt like fate." He paused, letting the significance register. "This building represents more than a real estate investment. It's about transforming spaces that were designed to exclude into communities that genuinely welcome." Richard absorbed this context, visibly processing how his role fit within this larger narrative. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words simple but weighted with genuine recognition. "I don't need your apology," Marcus replied, not unkindly. "But there are others who might. And more importantly, there are future residents and tenants across Boston who deserve better than what you and I experienced at different ends of the same system." He handed Richard a business card with the scheduled date for the resident council meeting. "This is your chance to be part of the solution, Mr. Whitman. Not as a manager this time, but as a contributor to something larger than individual properties or careers." After Richard departed, Sophia turned to Marcus with a raised eyebrow. "You believe he's sincere?" "I believe he's capable of sincerity," Marcus replied carefully. "Whether that translates to meaningful action remains to be seen. But people deserve the opportunity to evolve, especially when that evolution serves the greater good." He moved to the window, gazing out at the Boston skyline as afternoon transitioned toward evening, lights beginning to illuminate buildings across the river in Cambridge. The resident council will make the right decision. They understand what's at stake better than anyone. The transformation of Westfield Heights continued in the weeks that followed, extending beyond its physical structure to the human community it housed. The resident council, after intense deliberation, approved Richard's participation in the Fair Housing Initiative with specific conditions regarding accountability and ongoing assessment of the program's impact. The final phase of renovations neared completion, with the penthouse now ready for occupancy, though Marcus had made the unexpected decision to remain in Unit 501. "The view suits me," he explained when questioned, though those who knew him best understood the symbolic importance of remaining in the standard unit rather than separating himself in the literal and figurative heights of the building. The Boston Globe published Aisha Washington's follow-up piece, titled "From Confrontation to Community: How Westfield Heights Became a Model for Inclusive Luxury Housing." The article detailed not just the physical and policy changes implemented under the new ownership, but the cultural shift that had occurred as residents experienced the tangible benefits of equitable management. Most meaningful to Marcus was the waiting list that had developed for vacant units, a diverse array of applicants drawn not just by the building's prestige and location, but by its reputation as a community where all residents received equal respect and consideration. The transformative vision he had harbored for 15 years, from rejected applicant to change agent, was materializing in ways both measurable and intangible. 1 year after the confrontation on Commonwealth Avenue, Marcus stood at the podium, in the grand ballroom of Chicago's Palmer House Hotel, addressing the National Association of Realtors' annual conference. Beside him stood Richard Whitman, visibly nervous but resolute as he prepared to address the gathering of real estate professionals. "Real estate isn't just about property. It's about people and communities," Marcus began, surveying the attentive audience. "When we allow bias to influence housing decisions, we perpetuate divisions that have shaped our cities for generations." He gestured to Richard, introducing him with neither condemnation nor excessive praise, but as a necessary participant in the complex process of systemic change. "I'd like to introduce someone who has an important perspective to share. A year ago, Mr. Whitman and I had an encounter that went viral for all the wrong reasons. Today, he's helping to transform property management practices across Boston." Richard approached the podium, his movement deliberate as he faced the audience of industry peers. "My name is Richard Whitman, and a year ago I was the property manager who called the police on my new boss because I couldn't believe a black man had purchased our luxury building." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some recognizing the viral incident, others hearing of it for the first time. "I'm not proud of that moment," Richard continued, his voice steadying as he moved further into his prepared remarks. "But I'm grateful for the difficult lessons that followed. Today, I work with Mr. Johnson's Fair Housing Initiative, where my former mistakes serve as powerful teaching tools for other property managers." From the back of the auditorium, a reporter from the Boston Globe took notes for what would become an article titled "Unlikely Partners: how a viral confrontation led to systemic change in housing practices. The piece would highlight not just the transformation of Westfield Heights, but the ripple effects extending throughout Boston's real estate community, policy changes, training programs, and accountability measures implemented in properties across the city. As Marcus listened to Richard describe the concrete steps being taken to identify and correct discriminatory practices, he reflected on the journey from that confrontation on the sidewalk to this moment of public reconciliation. There was no perfect resolution, no simplistic narrative of villainy transformed to virtue. Instead, there was the messy, complicated, essential work of changing systems from within, one policy, one building, one person at a time. The transformation of Westfield Heights continued, now extending beyond its physical boundaries to influence practices throughout Boston's housing market. For Marcus Johnson, the measure of success was not in the professional recognition or media attention, but in the simple reality that future applicants would be evaluated based on their qualifications rather than assumptions about where they belonged. As he and Richard concluded their presentation and the audience rose in sustained applause, Marcus caught sight of Sophia in the front row, her expression conveying both approval of this public milestone and awareness of how much work remained. The transformation was ongoing, incomplete, imperfect, but irrevocably in motion. In the grand narrative of housing equality, Westfield Heights represented just one building, one story, one moment of reckoning. But as Marcus had learned throughout his journey from rejected applicant to change agent, transformation rarely occurs through sweeping revolutions alone. More often, it happens through persistent effort in specific spaces, through uncomfortable confrontations that lead to genuine reflection, through systems redesigned with intention and purpose. One building at a time. One policy at a time. One mindset at a time. The work continued, with all its challenges and possibilities, beneath the unchanged exterior of a prestigious Boston address, where the true value was not in its exclusivity, but in its gradual evolution toward genuine community. 5 years after the confrontation on Commonwealth Avenue, Marcus Johnson sat in his office on the ground floor of Westfield Heights, reviewing the quarterly financial reports with the measured attention that characterized his management style. The office, previously Richard Whitman's domain, had been redesigned to reflect Marcus's philosophy of transparent leadership. Large windows overlooked the lobby, reinforcing his accessibility to residents, while the interior wall featured a gallery of photographs documenting the building's transformation. The financial reports told a story of sustainable success. Property values had increased by 18% since the acquisition, outperforming comparable luxury buildings in the area. More significantly, resident retention rates had stabilized at 87%, an extraordinary figure in Boston's competitive housing market, where mobility among affluent tenants was typically much higher. Marcus set aside the reports and turned to the window, observing the now familiar rhythm of the lobby. The morning light streamed through the restored stained glass accents above the entrance, casting multicolored patterns across marble floors that had been preserved rather than replaced during renovations. A young couple with a toddler emerged. From the elevator, the child's laughter echoing in the space as they made their way toward the revolving door. Behind the reception desk, Gabriela Morales, hired 3 years earlier as part of Marcus's initiative to create career pathways for housing management professionals from underrepresented communities, greeted an elderly resident with warm familiarity while efficiently handling a delivery confirmation on her tablet. The scene embodied the vision Marcus had nurtured since purchasing the building, a community characterized by both luxury and inclusivity, historical preservation, and forward-thinking innovation. What had once been an exclusive enclave now represented a model of equitable management that had inspired similar transformations throughout Boston's high-end real estate market. A soft knock at his open door drew Marcus's attention from the lobby. Sophia Rodriguez entered, her professional attire now complemented by the confidence of someone whose innovative approaches had been validated by measurable success. The documentary crew is set up in the community room, she informed him. They've already interviewed Dr. Washington and Mrs. Cavendish. Quite the contrast in perspectives, but surprisingly aligned on the core benefits of the changes. Marcus nodded, unsurprised by this assessment. Aisha Washington and Eleanor Cavendish had, against all expectations, developed a genuine rapport through their service on the resident council. Two strong-willed women from different generations and backgrounds finding common purpose in building a community that served all its members. "And Richard?" Marcus asked, gathering his notes for the interview. "Has he arrived?" 10 minutes ago, Sophia confirmed. "He seems nervous but prepared. The producer mentioned they're particularly interested in capturing your interaction, the visual contrast between that first confrontation and your current working relationship." The PBS documentary series, Foundations, Rebuilding American Communities, had selected Westfield Heights as its season finale, an examination of how transformations in physical spaces could catalyze broader social change. The production had spent weeks interviewing residents, staff, and community leaders about the ripple effects stemming from the building's evolution under Marcus's ownership. 5 years, Marcus mused, straightening his tie as he prepared to leave the office. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and other times, like several lifetimes, Sophia completed the thought, a shared understanding born of their partnership. Through the challenges and triumphs of the past half-decade, the Wellington case study is now required reading at Harvard Business School, you know. Professor Coleman added it to the ethics curriculum last semester. This was news to Marcus, though not entirely surprising. The legal settlement with Wellington Property Group had evolved from a straightforward compensation agreement into a comprehensive blueprint for addressing systemic discrimination in luxury housing. The case had been cited in subsequent lawsuits, regulatory reforms, and corporate governance policies throughout the real estate industry. "Did they include the financial outcomes?" Marcus asked as they walked toward the community room. The fact that Wellington's properties have increased in value since implementing the required reforms undermines the persistent myth that discrimination is somehow economically advantageous. Sophia nodded in agreement. That's the aspect Richard emphasizes most in his training sessions, that equitable management practices aren't just ethically necessary, but financially sound. Coming from someone who once embodied the old approach, it carries particular weight. The mention of Richard reminded Marcus of the complex journey they had navigated together. After the National Association of Realtors conference, Richard had gradually established himself as an unlikely but effective advocate for fair housing practices. The training program that had begun as a form of personal atonement had expanded into a comprehensive initiative that now partnered with property management companies throughout New England. Richard himself had undergone a transformation that paralleled Westfield Heights in many ways, not a perfect rehabilitation or simplistic redemption narrative, but a genuine evolution characterized by ongoing effort and occasional setbacks. There had been moments of tension, instances where old patterns of thinking resurfaced, requiring difficult conversations and renewed commitment to the principles of equity that now guided both the building and the training program. As they approached the community room, Marcus could hear the murmur of voices and the technical instructions of the documentary crew as they adjusted lighting and camera positions. He paused momentarily outside the door, reflecting on the public nature of what had once been a private vision, the transformation of Westfield Heights from a symbol of exclusion to a model of inclusive luxury. "Ready?" Sophia asked, recognizing his momentary hesitation. "Always," Marcus replied with a smile that acknowledged the journey they had shared. The community room had been arranged for the interview, with comfortable chairs positioned before a backdrop of the building's historical photographs juxtaposed with images of its current incarnation. The documentary's director, an acclaimed filmmaker whose previous work had examined housing policy in American cities, approached as Marcus, and Sophia entered. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for making time for this," she said, extending her hand. "We've captured some remarkable perspectives from your residents and staff. Mrs. Cavendish was particularly eloquent about how her initial skepticism transformed into appreciation for what she called thoughtful modernization that respects history while discarding outdated prejudices. Marcus smiled at the characteristic phrasing. At 82, Eleanor Cavendish remained a formidable presence in the building. Her Yorkshire Terrier, now Pebbles Jr. after the original's peaceful passing 2 years earlier, still tucked perpetually under her arm as she participated in resident council meetings with unflagging energy. Mrs. Cavendish has been one of our most valuable community members, Marcus acknowledged. Her institutional memory combined with her willingness to embrace necessary change exemplifies the balance we've tried to strike. Across the room, Richard Whitman sat reviewing his notes, his appearance now reflecting a man who had found a new professional identity. The expensive suits that had once signaled his position of authority had been replaced by more modest attire, though still carefully selected and maintained. He looked up as Marcus entered, offering a nod of acknowledgement that contained neither subservience nor the defensive pride that had characterized their early interactions after his return. Their relationship had evolved into something neither man could have anticipated on that fateful Sunday afternoon, not friendship in the conventional sense, but a productive partnership founded on shared commitment to correcting the systems that had shaped them both in different ways. The director guided Marcus to the interview setting, where 2 chairs had been arranged for a conversation format, rather than a formal one-on-one interview. We thought it might be powerful to capture you and Mr. Whitman discussing the journey directly with each other, rather than separately addressing the camera. Would that be comfortable for both of you? Marcus glanced at Richard, who nodded his agreement. I think that would be authentic to how we've approached this work, Marcus confirmed, through direct conversation, even when challenging. As the technical crew made final adjustments to lighting and sound equipment, Marcus and Richard took their positions, the physical setup emphasizing both their connection and the distance that remained, chairs angled toward each other but with deliberate space between them. Before we begin, Richard said quietly, for Marcus's ears only, I wanted to mention that 3 more management companies signed on to the training program last month, including Meridian Properties. The significance wasn't lost on Marcus. Meridian managed several luxury buildings in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood and had been among the most resistant to examining their tenant selection and management practices. What changed their minds? Marcus asked. The data, Richard replied, simply. When we presented the 5-year outcomes from Westfield Heights and the other early adopters, higher retention rates, decreased maintenance costs, improved community stability, their board couldn't ignore the business case. The moral arguments matter, but in the end, it was the numbers that convinced them. This pragmatic assessment reflected Richard's evolved approach, no longer defending discriminatory practices as necessary for business success, but methodically demonstrating how equitable management delivered superior outcomes across all metrics that mattered to property owners and investors. The director called for quiet, and the cameras began recording. For the next hour, Marcus and Richard engaged in a candid conversation about the transformation of Westfield Heights and its broader implications. They discussed the initial confrontation without downplaying its ugliness, the challenging process of documenting systematic discrimination, the legal battle with Wellington, and the ongoing work of building an inclusive community without sacrificing the building's historic character or luxury amenities. The most significant change, Marcus observed toward the end of the interview, hasn't been in the physical infrastructure or the management policies, though both were necessary. It's been in creating a community where belonging isn't determined by assumptions, but by the simple fact of residency, where maintenance requests are handled based on urgency rather than the resident's background, where visitor policies are enforced consistently rather than selectively. Her observation cut to the heart of the leadership philosophy Marcus had cultivated, creating structures that embodied principles rather than relying on individual authority to maintain them. The transition would be a test of that philosophy, a demonstration of whether the transformation of Westfield Heights had truly taken root beyond his personal oversight. You're right, Marcus acknowledged. And perhaps that's the next phase of the legacy, proving that what we've built here can thrive independently while informing similar transformations elsewhere. As the conversation concluded and they prepared to leave the community room, Marcus's phone chimed with a notification, a message from Sophia about the next day's meeting with potential investors for an ambitious new project. The Westfield Initiative, as they had named it, aimed to acquire and transform additional properties throughout Boston using the blueprint developed over 5 years at Westfield Heights. The expansion represented both opportunity and challenge. The B-Board chance to extend their impact beyond a single building balanced against the risk of diluting the personalized approach that had made their initial success possible. But the fundamental vision remained consistent, creating spaces where luxury and inclusivity coexisted, where historical character and progressive values reinforced rather than contradicted each other. The following morning, Marcus stood on the roof terrace of Westfield Heights, watching the sunrise illuminate the Boston skyline. The space had been one of the most significant additions during the renovations, a communal area that offered panoramic views previously available only to penthouse residents. Now, any resident could reserve the terrace for gatherings or simply enjoy its peaceful ambiance during open hours. As golden light gradually revealed the city's architectural tapestry, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the aspiring graduate student rejected without explanation to the successful entrepreneur returning as owner, from the confrontation on the sidewalk to the transformation documented for national audiences, each phase had contributed to a legacy that extended beyond the building's physical boundaries. Sophia joined him on the terrace, coffee cups in hand, their early morning strategy sessions having become a ritual over the years. "The investor presentation is finalized," she reported, handing him one of the cups. "The 5-year data makes a compelling case for expansion." Marcus accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "And the community impact assessment? Did we integrate Dr. Washington's suggestions?" "Fully incorporated," Sophia confirmed. "The metrics for success go beyond financial returns to include resident satisfaction, diversity benchmarks, and community engagement indicators, exactly as we discussed." The comprehensive evaluation framework represented Marcus's commitment to measuring what truly mattered, not just property values and occupancy rates, but the human experience of those who called Westfield Heights home. It was this holistic approach that had gradually influenced Boston's broader real estate market as other luxury properties recognized that ethical practices and economic prosperity could advance together. "I received an interesting email last night," Marcus mentioned, turning from the view to face his business partner and friend. "From a former applicant who was rejected by Richard 5 years ago. He recently moved into Unit 302 and wanted to share what it meant to him to live in a building where he had once been told he wouldn't be a good fit." Such communications had become increasingly common as word spread about Westfield Heights' transformed policies. Former applicants who had faced rejection under the previous management sometimes returned, their successful residency serving as both personal vindication and public testimony to the possibility of change. "That's the real legacy," Sophia observed, understanding the significance without need for elaboration. "Not the renovations or the policies, but the experiences of people who were previously excluded." Marcus nodded in agreement, his gaze returning to the awakening city. Boston's architecture told a story of American history, colonial foundations, industrial growth, modern innovation, but also of segregation, exclusion, and privilege. The work at Westfield Heights represented not an erasure of that complex heritage, but an evolution toward a more equitable future built upon honest reckoning with the past. "Ready for the next phase?" Sophia asked, her question encompassing both the immediate investor meeting and the broader expansion of their vision. "Always," Marcus replied, the same response he had offered countless times throughout their partnership. It reflected not blind optimism, but a grounded commitment to continuing the work, regardless of challenges that might emerge. Together they left the terrace, making their way to the conference room where potential investors would soon gather. The documentary crew had requested permission to film this meeting as well, recognizing its significance in the ongoing narrative of Westfield Heights. Not an endpoint, but a transition to a new chapter of impact. As they walked through the building's corridors, residents offered morning greetings, some with the casual familiarity of long acquaintance, others with the respectful acknowledgement due to effective leadership. The interactions reflected the community culture that had developed over 5 years, neither artificially formal nor inappropriately familiar, but grounded in mutual respect and shared investment in the building's success. In the lobby, the morning light now fully illuminated the space. Staff members attended to their responsibilities with quiet efficiency, and the revolving door continued its steady rhythm as residents departed for work, school, or daily errands. Richard Whitman stood near the entrance, preparing to leave after his final interview with the documentary crew, his expression thoughtful as he observed the lobby's morning cadence. He noticed Marcus and Sophia approaching and waited to exchange brief farewells. "The producer asked me what I would tell my younger self if I could go back to that Sunday afternoon 5 years ago," he shared, a rueful smile suggesting the obvious answer. "Beyond the obvious, don't call the police, I mean." "And what did you tell her?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about Richard's reflection on the moment that had altered both their lives so dramatically. "That assumptions aren't just harmful to others. They're blinders that limit your own understanding of the world," Richard replied. "And that sometimes the most important growth comes from your most humiliating mistakes, if you're willing to truly examine them." The observation contained no request for validation or absolution, merely an honest assessment of his personal journey alongside the building's transformation. In that sense, Richard's evolution paralleled Westfield Heights itself, imperfect, ongoing, but significantly altered from its former state. As Richard departed, and Marcus and Sophia continued toward the conference room, Marcus reflected on the EU legacy they had built. Not a completed achievement, but a living testament to the possibility of change. Westfield Heights stood as both physical structure and symbolic statement, a demonstration that spaces designed for exclusion could be reclaimed and repurposed for community, that systems built on discrimination could be dismantled and reconstructed. With equity at their foundation, the work was far from finished. Boston's housing market remained stratified by race and class. Luxury buildings throughout the city continued to employ subtle barriers against certain applicants. The economic divide that separated neighborhoods persisted despite incremental progress. But Westfield Heights offered tangible proof that transformation was possible, not through revolution, but through persistent, principled effort to change systems from within. As they reached the conference room and prepared to present their vision for expansion, Marcus carried with him the knowledge that each step forward created new possibilities. Each barrier removed opened pathways previously blocked. The legacy of Westfield Heights lived not just in its transformed policies or renovated spaces, but in every resident who now called it home without question of whether they belonged, in every property manager who recognized discrimination as both morally indefensible and economically unsound, in every investor who understood that ethical practice and financial success could advance hand in hand. The confrontation on Commonwealth Avenue 5 years earlier had been merely the catalyst. The true transformation had unfolded day by day, decision by decision, in the unglamorous but essential work of building community across differences, of honoring history while refusing to be bound by its prejudices, of demonstrating that luxury could be defined by quality rather than exclusivity. That was the enduring legacy of Westfield Heights. Not just a building transformed, but a model for what was possible when commitment to equity met with strategic vision and persistent effort. As Marcus opened the door to greet the waiting investors, he carried that legacy forward into its next chapter, one decision at a time. 10 years after purchasing Westfield Heights, Marcus Johnson stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., addressing a congressional committee on housing equity in America's urban centers. Behind him sat a panel of experts he had assembled, developers, community advocates, legal scholars, and residents, representing the diverse perspectives necessary for meaningful policy reform. What began as a personal mission to transform one building has evolved into a movement that spans 27 properties across 8 cities, Marcus testified, presenting the comprehensive data gathered through the Westfield Initiative. The evidence is conclusive. Equitable housing practices not only correct historical injustices, but create stronger communities and more stable investments. Among those seated in the gallery was Richard Whitman, now director of the Fair Housing Training Institute that had grown from those first tentative workshops into a nationally recognized certification program for property managers. Beside him sat Dr. Aisha Washington, whose scholarly work on housing discrimination had informed key portions of the proposed legislation under consideration. The original confrontation on Commonwealth Avenue had long since been transformed from personal humiliation and vindication into a case study examined by students of urban planning, business ethics, and civil rights law. What remained was the legacy, not of conflict, but of the painstaking, persistent work that had followed. Westfield Heights itself continued to thrive under the management structure Marcus had established before transitioning to his role at Harvard's Center for Equitable Urban Development. The Resident Council, now in its 10th year, had become a model studied and adapted by properties throughout the country. The building's waiting list remained long, its community stable, its reputation defined not by exclusivity, but by excellence in both services and governance. As Marcus concluded his testimony and prepared to answer questions from the committee members, he caught sight of Sophia in the gallery, her subtle nod communicating shared recognition of how far they had come from that Sunday afternoon confrontation. What had begun as one man's determination to reclaim a space that had once rejected him had expanded into a movement with the potential to reshape housing policy for generations to come. The legacy continued to unfold, one building, one policy, one life at a time, the transformation neither complete nor perfect, but irrevocably in motion toward a future where belonging was determined not by assumption or appearance, but by the fundamental dignity accorded to all who sought a place to call home the end